Good afternoon. I'm Robert Viscusi. I'm the chair of the organizing committee for the Robert L. Hess Scholar in Residence program. Every year or two, we invite a scholar or a writer or a practitioner of some art with a fairly wide range of reference to come and talk with us, with various classes, groups of students and faculty over the space of a week. We have scheduled no fewer than 15 separate events for our guest this week, and he's been quite a good sport about it. We've been plying him with coffee, so I think he'll be able to stay sitting straight up for this hour. I should say Thomas Frank. I'm not going to say much about him because I'm sure James will say more. Thomas Frank is a journalist and political analyst of tremendous originality and tremendous distinction. I think that his book, What's the Matter with Kansas, is probably the most interesting political book I've read in the last 15 years. And I've read it a couple of times. It's just enormously original and also troubling, as any honest book about American politics needs to be these days. With that, I'll give this over to James Davis of the English Department, who is the chair for this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming, and to the instructors who encouraged their classes to attend. I'm really happy to be able to speak with Thomas Frank this afternoon. Bob introduced him, and so you know some of his more recent accomplishments. The topic for this segment has to do primarily, maybe not exclusively, with some of his earlier work. And specifically what I want to ask him to speak to us about is a project that began in, I guess technically in the late 1980s, but really caught on and got momentum in the 1990s, which was the production of a magazine that he founded and edited for a long time called The Baffler. And I'm going to circulate some of my own personal copies from the 1990s of The Baffler. And I want to say a couple of things about why the magazine was significant to me personally, and then try to open that up a little bit onto some questions for Mr. Frank and issues that may engage those of you who are in your late teens and early 20s these days, instead of in the 1990s like I was. So while I do that, I need to go to the PowerPoint, and I want to talk to you about some of the things you're seeing there. And I'm going to send around these copies as well. So the reason that the title of this segment is called Commodify Your Dissent is because a couple of anthologies of collected essays that had originally been published in the Baffler over the first 10 or 15 years, I guess, of its publication, were collected into these volumes, the first of which was Commodify Your Dissent. And so we decided for that on the title, it captures some of the spirit, the tone of the early essays. And I'll just say that for me, I was a graduate student in the humanities in the early mid-90s. And to me, this magazine was like a breath of fresh air. It had, I was a sort of disillusioned doctoral student in English at a big Midwestern university that shall remain nameless. And although I was totally interested in my coursework and in my studies, I also definitely felt a disconnect between real-world concerns that I wanted to stay connected to. And what this magazine did was it bridged some of the kind of erudition and the analytical, the kind of bracing analytical work that I was hoping for in graduate school, but it also looked very closely at what was happening on the ground in the social, political terrain in the country at the time. And so it expressed a lot of the things that I was feeling myself in the 90s. It was extremely angry, and it was combative, and it was totally unapologetic about that. It was pissed off at the direction that the country was headed, but it was also really playful, and it was very satirical. And I found all those qualities really, really compelling. It had a very sensitive nose for bullshit, but it wasn't just a screed, it wasn't just a rant. It also contained lots of smart political analysis, so I valued it for that reason. Those of you who have read Catcher in the Rye, you can think of Holden Caulfield growing up, going to a doctoral program in labor studies, and then starting a punk rock label. That would kind of be the amalgamation of the Baffler. The other great thing about the Baffler was that I could afford to buy it. It didn't come out that often. It was pretty sporadic in its publication, especially in the early years. And I was making $4.35 shelving books in the university library, $4.35 an hour, shelving books in the university library. And on that salary, I could go every once in a while to Morgenstern's bookstore and find it for $5 until they upped the price to $7 in the late 90s. And so I could afford to get it, and it was always exciting. It was exciting to me because, as I said, it expressed this kind of alarm at the direction that things were headed, as corporations were basically infringing and spreading their tentacles into every single aspect and element of American society. And also the writing. The writing itself was so astringent. It was so shrewd in its analysis. It was really different from what you found in the mainstream press, and it was different from what you found in academic writing. And so it kind of gave me hope that this sort of like very shrewd cultural analysis could make a difference, that it might re-energize some kind of a movement politics, that it might be able to put the brakes on the train wreck, basically, that was what I had just learned to call late capitalism. The other thing that it did, here's some other covers, was it really skewered academia, which was at the time producing a lot of sort of political gymnastics that were actually very politically acquiescent. But it also, at the same time that it skewered academia, it also held up, it really championed book learning. It championed a clear command of history and a kind of a skeptical turn of mind, which are all values that we associate with the Academy. So I appreciated the magazine very much for all of those reasons. Here's a couple more.
The orange one, that was our best one ever. That was my view. Yeah, the number 9.
Sort of a proletarian realist representation of an intern going to work.
Yeah.
There was actually an article about the intern industry in that.
Interns built the pyramids.
Yeah. A couple more. So I want to come back to the appearance and the physical thing of the Baffler later. To give you a sense, though, of the kind of the extraordinary range, the kind of command of the types of concerns that this magazine contained, I thought I'd give you a couple of examples. Just look at the index of the book, Commodify Your Dissent. Just a couple of examples, okay? This is actual true sample of the index to the letter A in Commodify Your Dissent, okay? Amtrak, Animal House, Apollinaire, St. Thomas Aquinas, Arby's, Arena, Matthew Arnold, Arsenic and Old Lace, Art Institute of Chicago, AT&T, Atlantic Records, and the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. You get a sense of the voracious, the almost promiscuous way in which the writers for this magazine were committed to just unearthing and investigating so many aspects of American popular culture, corporate culture, at the same time that they were deeply immersed in academic discourse. Here's the letter J, just for fun. J. Crew, Kenneth Jackson, Michael Jackson, Samuel Jackson, Russell Jacoby, Mick Jagger, Henry James, Jim Jarmusch, Thomas Jefferson, Jesus and Mary Chain, Joan of Arc, and Billy Joel. You get a feeling for the texture of what type of a magazine this really was, just from the index from the collection.
I never thought of that.
Okay, so on the cover of Commodify Your Dissent is this icon, which I haven't reproduced with very high pixelated resolution up there, but it's the icon of a bulldozer, and this seemed like a fitting visual emblem for where I wanted to begin my conversations with you. I wondered if you could just take us back to, I've just taken everyone back to my own personal historical moment in the 90s, but take us back to where you and your colleagues were at that point. You were in Chicago. Who were the people who were creating the magazine? Who did you imagine yourselves writing this for? And then if I can just follow up with a second question on that, why is it that the magazine took aim so squarely, not so much at like Reagan and Newt Gingrich and the right, but almost as much at sort of Bill Clinton, the Nike Corporation?
Because he deserved it.
Okay, so say more about where you were in the 90s with this.
Okay. Is this guy on? Let's see. I don't think it's working. Now I think I broke it. It is on? Y'all can hear me? Yep. I should say a word about that bulldozer. It's kind of a funny story. After the magazine had become a success, we had to get a bank account, and we went to the bank and opened the bank account, and we were ordering checks, and they said, do you want a design on your checks? And we're like, what kind of design do you got? You got one that'd be appropriate for like really really touchy literary magazine. People are really angry all the time. No, that's a joke. Of course, we didn't ask them that, but they had a book of all the designs that you could put on your checks. These little, generic symbols like this, and we came to the Bulldoze, and we're like, oh, we've got to have that on our checks. And so our checks all had that bulldozer on them, and we, it resonated for us, and so we started just putting it everywhere, and that's that's where it came from. That's sort of who we were, earth-moving equipment. So who were we? We were. It started when I had just graduated from the University of Virginia, but then I went to the University of Chicago for graduate school and sort of took the operation with me. And it was me and my various friends at the University of Chicago, and we were, I guess discontented is the right word, but we weren't just discontented with the world around us, with the political direction that things were going in, although that was obviously an important thing. But we were pretty unhappy with academia as well, which is where we all were. And this was as James mentioned, the era of high theory. This was the time when what you studied. I don't know what academia is like anymore because I'm not part of it now, but. When you studied a subject, what you did was study how that subject was studied. It was all very meta. You understand what I'm saying? Everything was turned in on itself, and was highly theoretical. And people prized. Yeah, prized is the right word. This kind of opaque writing that was very difficult to understand. This was thought to be. This was a hallmark of being learned, this kind of and that's where the title of the magazine comes from. We're making fun of academic prose. We thought we were also unhappy with the world around us. This was the age of Clinton. Bill Clinton was president, and as I had forgotten, James, until you said it, the idea that the fingers of the corporation were becoming they were everywhere. They were coming into every part of life, and there was I haven't thought about that in years. That's sort of a critique that has died, and the reason it's died is because it's become obsolete. And the reason it's become obsolete is because it's not remarkable anymore. That there's branding images everywhere you go. And everywhere that you look. But I remember in those days there was something kind of shocking and new about it. Do you all know who Naomi Klein is? The Canadian journalist. She wrote a book later. She was one of our group. I forget which issue she wrote for. But she was definitely one of our comrades. And she wrote a book called No Logo about this subject, sort of taking it to where it needed to go, and describing people's on the one hand, the efforts of corporations to insert themselves into every part of human existence, and on the other hand, people's efforts to escape that, which were, people becoming more and more desperate in those days. But that book came out, and then 9/11, I think, was the next year, and that was haven't thought about that ever since. And we were pissed off about so many things. I remember a really crystallizing moment for me. Well, we were also really interested in the music scene. Okay, I should say there's so many important things that I haven't thought about in years. I was a little punk rocker at the time, and this was exactly the moment when Nirvana, do you know who this was? This band Nirvana was being discovered by the mainstream, by a commercial record industry, right? By the commercial music industry, was just figuring out about what was going on with punk rock and alternative rock and all of this stuff that we were listening to, and so it felt often like we were under siege. Like here was this great world of money wanted what me and my friends had and wanted to turn it into a product, and we were determined to resist that somehow, through pranks or through denunciation or through whatever, and or putting out a magazine. And that's what we did. And I remember there was a point in the mid-'90s, in '94, I believe it was, when what you said about that we were also engaged with academia, but also with real life. I remember there was a moment, there was a big strike in central Illinois. So there's a town called Decatur in Illinois, and they had there were 3 strikes going on at the same time in this little town. There was well, it doesn't matter the particulars anymore, but basically the entire this town was in a state of civil war. They weren't actually shooting each other, but they were real damn close to it. The police were gassing people and stuff like pepper gassing, and the entire blue collar population of the town was either out on strike or was scabbing, and they were just about at each other's throats. And we went down there, and I wrote a big, long essay about this. It didn't appear in the Baffler, but it was a real turning point for me because I suddenly figured out that here were people, and these are not the kind of people that you are taught to respect in academia. These are people that didn't even go to college, but these were people that understood the political situation that we were in and the industrial situation that we were in, or financial situation, or however you want to put it, much better than any of the people I knew back at the University of Chicago. And they were their lives and their livelihoods, I should say, were on the line. And of course, it didn't end well for them. Ended very badly. But for me, it was a real eye-opening moment when I suddenly understood the direction that this country was going in, and where the currents of history were carrying us, and it's also pretty much when I became disillusioned with Bill Clinton, and Clinton became a kind of symbol for me of the age. Okay, he was a populist. You guys remember much about Bill Clinton? He was a man of the people. He loved to eat at McDonald's. Do you remember this? And he loved nothing better than to walk down the crowded main street of a town and shake every single person's hand, right? He loved that. And he loved people. He loved being around people. But and in 1992, when he ran for president, he said a lot of the kind of things that Barack Obama said, and that well, hell, people like Occupy Wall Street say now. The 1% and against everybody else, and we've got to do something about mass incarceration. All of these things. He was so wonderful. And then he becomes president, and what does he do? All of his populism, it's like it gets rented out by Wall Street. And suddenly what he is, his populism is no longer about us. It's about the business world. Okay, and that sounds like, that doesn't probably make any sense to you. But what I'm trying to get across is the idea that this was the great theme of the 1990s. I later came up with a term for it. I called it market populism. Okay, but the idea that markets are the ultimate expression of the popular will. And what Wall Street is doing, what those marketers, those corporations that I was so worried about and angry at, that were taking away our music and that were pushing their logos into every aspect of human life, those were the real expressions of the will of the people. And what these, actual people on the ground in a place like Decatur, Illinois, were fighting for, that was nothing. That was, if anything, they would have said that's an act of elitism. And that's what Bill Clinton symbolized for me. That's what the 90s were all about in my mind. It was this sort of inversion of the way we'd always thought about who's an elite and who's the people, who's the common people. And that's really what we tried to get at in this magazine. Yeah.
I want to follow up. You mentioned about some of the direction, the currents of history in the 90s, and the subtitle to the book Commodify Dissent is The Business of Culture in the New Gilded Age.
I was one of the first ones to use that phrase. I looked it up a while ago because it's now everywhere. The idea of a new Gilded Age. Yeah. And I went back and we thought we were pretty clever coming up with that term. And I went back and did a LexisNexis search, and there were some examples of people using it before. This was 1997. There were some people using it before then, but not very many, and none that I had seen. So we thought we were coining something new. What's funny is now that term is everywhere, including I saw Hillary Clinton use it the other day, saying, that we're in a new Gilded Age now. It's like, Jesus Christ, Hillary. Weren't you paying attention when you were in the White House? Remember your husband? But yeah.
To some extent, it goes to your point about the way in which a centrist politics can co-opt and adopt some of the discourse that's coming out of the left in order to defang it and to neutralize it. You and the co-editors of the anthology wrote that the economic order into which we are blithely stepping on the eve of the millennium is a terrifying one. So can you just unpack this idea of the new Gilded Age a little bit for us, and what is it that made it so terrifying? I mean, you've been speaking about it a bit.
Okay, so the term that we use now is inequality. President Obama talks about inequality. Occupy Wall Street talked about inequality. We used that term, but that wasn't, the new Gilded Age was sort of our stab at getting at this phenomenon. But this was obviously what was happening in the 1990s, just as it is today. I remember a statistic that I'll actually be showing a slide of it tomorrow. I have all my old PowerPoint stuff from the 90s. But there was a statistic that came out in either 99 or 2000 where the CEOs, the average CEO in America earned something like 400 times as much as their blue-collar line worker made in those days. This is in 1999. And this was up from something like 40 to 1 in the 1970s. And it was just going on, it was going off the scale. And you could see this happening all around you. You could see the inequality taking off. The McMansion craze had already begun back then. The part of Chicago where we lived hadn't really been gentrified, Hyde Park, but there's a story that I always like to tell. So I moved to Chicago in '88, I guess it was, and I moved out in 2003. And I remember when I moved to Chicago in 1988, that was still a pretty hard bit, and that was a pretty tough town. It was very blue collar. The rich areas were confined to the North Lakeshore, North Shore part of the city, or else you had to go all the way up to the suburbs. Hyde Park, the neighborhood where the University of Chicago was particularly a tough area. Lot of crime. They were closing down the last of the steel mills at the time. I mean, it was deindustrialization was in full swing, or was just coming to an end. And then when I loved that place, by the way. I loved that city. It was a great place. I had a wonderful time in that. This is a place that nobody feels any nostalgia for. Chicago in the 1980s. Well, I loved it. Thought it was the greatest place in the world, and I could afford everything. That was one of the great one of our slogans at the Baffle. I don't know if we ever printed it. Was the secret to happiness is low overhead, and that was something that we most definitely had in the South Side of Chicago back in those days. You could live very, very cheaply. When I finally moved out in 2003, I remember driving around the city to pick up all the various things I'd loaned out to people over the years, and saying, Jesus Christ, they've gentrified the whole goddamn place. You'd go from neighborhood to neighborhood. Have you ever heard of the neighborhood Wicker Park? Everyone's heard of it. 'Cause it's like a proto-Brooklyn. This was the place. This is the first neighborhood in Chicago that where like indie rock, punk rock culture gave way to millionaires, millionaires moving in and fixing everything up, and how the hell that happened, that was just a mystery to my friends and I. We wrote about that many times in the magazine. We had a name for it. The name that we put on the essay about that, we called it Zoned Bohemian. It was we were just sitting around there one day looking around it saying, like, it's what's happened here. Is it like the city zoned this place for hipsters or something? What the hell? And like I say, so when I moved out in 2003, I remember driving around the city and being astonished at how much of the city had become a place for wealth and a place for money, right? And I went back there for the first time since 2003 last year, and really one of my friends now, a guy that used to write for the magazine all the time, he calls it the green zone. Basically, the gentrified area of Chicago is this green zone, like in Baghdad. And you get outside of that, and it's like this free fire zone. This incredible murder rate going on, all sorts of awful things. Hyde Park, where I used to live, is also where Barack Obama's house is. And so Hyde Park now has Secret Service is patrolling down there, and that naturally has made it a very, very safe neighborhood indeed, and it's correspondingly has gentrified a whole lot. We used to live in a rundown mansion from the 19th century. This house built in the 1880s. It was completely falling apart. I mean, it was just a ruin, and we loved it. We'd have this great time in this place, and I went back there, and it's been like recalled back into the realm of the very rich, okay? So there's the heir to one of the great American fortunes owns it now and has built a great big security fence around it, and it's all fixed up and it's beautifully painted and it looks like it's brand new. Very comical. Now, there's one other point that I've neglected to make about the Baffler and its critique, and that is the complicity of, and this is especially pertinent to you guys here in Brooklyn, which is the complicity of hipness and gentrification, or the complicity of hipness and the corporate, the sort of onrushing corporate steamroller. And this is an argument that we made and that was pretty controversial at the time, but now in retrospect just seems obvious, which is that hip youth culture, alternative youth culture, is extremely valuable as a way of selling crap and as a way of explaining the sort of financial order that we live in. So instead of being adversarial, it's complicit, and it's deeply complicit. And it's obviously complicit. And like I say, that made us a lot of enemies at the time. And today, looking back, that's obvious. In fact, I'm kind of embarrassed now that all of this sort of punk rock and alternative culture that I really loved, everywhere that stuff sort of took root and took hold has now become a hot spot of gentrification, or something much worse than gentrification. Like one of these innovative cities that Richard Florida celebrates. You know who this guy is? Nobody knows who Richard Florida is. Well, shit, I'm getting way ahead of myself here. I should stop there. Oh, you had one other question. Who did we think we were writing for? This is an interesting thing. Nobody. We would always talk about this. Who's our target audience? Nobody. We're writing for ourselves. We would always say this. We had no target audience. That was one of our stupid things.
Well, I mean, that's one element of reading the pieces. Not that it was clearly not meant for anyone else, but some of the pieces read like they're venting, right? These are things you need to get off your chest, whether anyone's going to read them or not. I wondered, given, the copies have been circulating around, if people want to write opinions, create a magazine today, there's something very, very kind of punk DIY about cranking out a magazine and composing it and putting it together physically. Today, what would someone do? Would the Baffler be a blog? If it were
I
to,
wonder
if it
about
came
that.
out today?
But it was slightly different. It might be, but it'd be a blog written by a rotating cast of characters. It'd have to be a bunch of different cast of characters. But there was something else about the Baffler, which is, and we've been talking about this all day, and about in my journalistic experience, the Baffler was really carefully edited, and almost too carefully edited. You were reading it at the time, but you probably noticed that a lot of the voices sound the same. Not the same, but they all are in harmony. And this is because the editorial hand in those days, we would intervene in the text a lot. The other editors and I would really edit things carefully, and that's not done anymore. That's I don't know of any blogs that do anything like that. That's something that you can only achieve with a magazine of this sort, and also you can only achieve it with the consent of the authors. And a lot of authors, that rub them the wrong way. People sometimes don't like to be edited, at all, as we discovered. I learned a lot about putting out a magazine. If you have any questions about how to put out a magazine, I'm the guy to ask. I mean, it's a totally obsolete technology, but I'm really good at it.
You mentioned before that the phrase people use now is income inequality, and you mentioned the Occupy movement. You've written critically about the Occupy movement. Arguably, it's been the most sort of forceful expression of that class resentment,
Yeah.
which is quite audible in the writings of the Baffler. Kind of outrage against the plutocrats, and in a generation. So, given those early sympathies of yours, given your political commitments, what was it about the Occupy movement that disappointed you or troubled you?
Oh, it's so there's. I criticize almost everyone, and usually I'm criticizing people for the opposite reason, because I think that their dissent is fake, that their dissent is commodified, that their dissent is just a way of moving units for some media conglomerate or something like that, But with Occupy, I felt different. I felt like these guys had a real chance. They had a real shot at the culture was ready. People were furious. People were angry at the banks, and these guys had a chance at really getting something done. And it annoyed me that they blew it. But there's also a lot of pent-up annoyance that Obama expressed in that as well. That here's another great example of a man who had a chance, who we all expected to do something really wonderful, and who didn't get it done. He had it right there in front of him, and he knew what to do, or maybe he didn't know what to do. I mean, we'll never know until he writes his next volume of memoirs. But Occupy was so caught up in the sort of tactical issues that they could barely get anything done at all. For example, we talked earlier today and yesterday about their. Was it today? Was it yesterday? I think it was today. About their refusal to have demands, which was they thought was a very high-minded thing to do. I think that was a terrible mistake. You get those demands out there. You put it in a really resonant, a really well-phrased form, and that's something that people will remember for decades. Not only will they remember it for decades, but there'll be every politician that comes down the pike. They'll be saying to them, "Here's Occupy's." Occupy, which is long gone, but here's their 10 points. They come with a name for it, Here's their 10 points. Where do you stand on these, And every politician would have to answer that question. And now they're gone, and we've got nothing to show for it. I always think back to as everyone who's now heard all my stupid comments over the last few days, my favorite political movement, which was Populism in the 1890s. And they very famously had a manifesto. They called it the Omaha Platform. They got together in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892, I think it was, and wrote a platform. And they got one of the really fine writer to do it, and he wrote this platform that absolutely sings. It's beautiful. It's so well written. I mean, it'll never be forgotten. And then they had their list of demands, and about half of those things came true. The politicians, after the populists were gone, they did them. You know, it took years, but they got them done. And that's largely because people remembered they'd put that stuff down on paper. Well, this was a tremendous missed opportunity. And I also think that Occupy was so caught up in exactly the kind of academic theory talk that I disliked back in the 1990s. In fact, it was I wrote about this in the new Baffler. It's now edited by some other people, but I wrote about it there. I was really excited about Occupy when it first happened. I was overjoyed. I was like, over the moon, fantastic. And then I remember watching a panel discussion on the computer, and the panelists all were these are people from Occupy, trying to one-up each other with this kind of academic talk, as theory speak, as though that was what you needed to do to build a mass movement and talk to average Americans. And I was like, what the hell are they doing? That's not going to enlist, that's not going to bring anybody in. That's not going to, advance this movement 1 inch. This is one thing that we know from the Baffler, is that clear expression is a huge part of what you have to be able to do in these movements. And these guys wanted to go the other direction and retreat into this kind of academic, crossword puzzle language. I didn't get that, and it was it's a missed opportunity. Is the sad thing about it.
Mm-hmm. I want to make sure we leave time for questions. I did want to follow up with one other thing. You've been talking about the importance of words and of language, making clear statements. So, especially with a room full of students and professors, how did you learn to write?
God, I don't know. I don't know how I learned to write. I've wondered about that. Because it's, and I think about it all the time. Is it just regurgitation of phrases that I memorized when I was a child or something? Like when I was really young, I read all the Sherlock Holmes books. Everybody used to do that. Maybe they still do. I always find myself like lapsing into that kind of Victorian English, and I'm sure it's because I read those things when I was young and impressionable. I honestly don't know how I learned how to write. I have no idea.
One of the reasons I ask is because in the early Baffler writings, there's references to, well, we're sort of trying to channel or model ourselves on the kind of the H.L. Mencken voice.
Well, he's my hero.
The Randolph Bourne, Harold Stearns, people that no one teaches or reads anymore. What is it about their sensibility or about their prose that spoke to you? I'm sorry, I should have. I know that's. No, that wasn't my original question.
So my H.L. Mencken, the cover of the book it's supposed to look like a famous magazine from the 1920s that, you're right, nobody reads anymore. The magazine was called the American Mercury, and it was edited by a guy called H.L. Mencken. We'll skip the rest of the Mencken references, the visual references, but Mencken was a kind of kind of literary genius who didn't go to college, by the way. He was from Baltimore, lived in the same house his entire life, was born in it, died in it, and he was not a left-winger at all. He was a libertarian, but he was an amazing writer, and he lived to make people angry. So this is a guy who was Baltimore was pretty much a southern city at the time, and he gloried in pissing off Southerners. Lord knows why. I mean, because it was the thing to do. And he was famous for denouncing in the 1920s. You had this Klan Renaissance, Ku Klux Klan Renaissance, and he just gloried in making these guys mad and calling them names and talking about how stupid they were and how they had to hide under hoods. He loved to make fun of President Harding, President Coolidge. He basically loved to make fun of the United States. And he would sometimes even say, I'm not really an American, even though he was obviously born in America. He would say he was a German or something like that because his ancestors were. But he loved to piss off middle-class America, just loved to do it. And he did it in the most beautiful way. His prose was just fantastic. And he also produced like no other journalist I've ever heard of. He wrote a daily column, he wrote a weekly column, and he edited a monthly magazine. All of this at the same time. The man was extraordinary. And when I first was exposed to Mencken's writing. Oh, I know how you'll know who he is. Have y'all ever seen the movie Inherit the Wind, about the monkey trial? You know what the monkey trial is? The journalist character who's so scoffing and doesn't believe in God and is like making fun of everybody, making fun of all the fundamentalists. That's supposed to be Mencken. That's based on H.L. Mencken. And I was first exposed to him, I think it was in junior high school, and somebody gave me a volume of Mencken's essays, of his most famous essays. And I was just reading them thinking like, oh my God, this guy is the greatest, because he was so willing to just attack whatever the sacred cow of the moment was. He would just go right after it, you know. And by the way, he also, his other claim to fame, which we don't remember very much anymore, with it, in his magazine, he introduced America to all sorts of great writers. I was thinking of in particular, Richard Wright, who we all know now, who's a writer who still is read today, who wrote Native Son. And Wright also was an admirer of Mencken, even though they didn't agree politically. They were, you know, big fans of each other's prose. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think that was an esoteric or an obscure thing to like Mencken in the 1990s. I thought that was an honorable thing to have that as my as our antecedent. But it is funny that he's so completely forgotten today. But for me, he was, I mean, I still, when I'm in a bad mood, I get one of the Mencken books off the shelf and read for a while, and he always cheers me up. But there was a negative man. There was a bitter and pessimistic man who just loved to watch the world go to hell. And one time somebody asked him, they said, Mr. Mencken, you know, you're always saying what fools Americans are. Why don't you, oh God, how did they put it? They're like, why do you stay? They said, why do you stay here if you think Americans are such fools? And he thought about it for a second. And he said, why do people go to zoos?
Wow.
Yeah, my hero.
I can imagine there are a number of people in the room who may want to do the kind of writing that's politically engaged, politically astute. And one of the things that students hear a lot now is, well, if you want to, get into almost any kind of industry, but especially like a journalistic or a writing type of industry, is you've got to do internships. And I want you to help me with this one because I've never been able to figure this out. On the one hand, it seems to me that, of course, you have to do internships because everybody else is doing internships. You got to do several of them, right? And if you don't, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. On the other hand, we know from the Baffler number 9, Jim Fredrickson's internship industry, that it's such a fundamentally exploitative system, and it really disadvantages people who don't have the wealth, the accumulated wealth, to be able to go and work for free for a lot of time. Never mind the free labor that you're donating to the companies. So, Mr. Frank, you're a very smart man. Maybe you can help us out of this conundrum, and I guess specifically from the point of view of a writer. If you want to be a writer, maybe there are some of you out there, what do you do? What do you do with that? And I'm sure these guys hear it almost like a mantra.
Yeah. Well, the internship system is unfair. And we knew that. By the way, the guy that wrote that essay, Jim Frederick, he died just very recently. Died very young. He became an editor at Time magazine, and I believe he was the editor in Hong Kong. Really great writer. I really liked that guy. I liked his prose. We corresponded by email. I never met him in person. It was the case with many of our authors, or we corresponded by mail back then. But great guy. Anyhow. He ended that essay by saying, the way the system is going now, this is by the way, he wrote that in 1997, I believe it was, the Intern Economy, where they had already bid down the price of interns' labor to nothing, right, where people had to work for free. And he said, the obvious next step is that you'll have to pay them to work for them. And this has come to pass. This exists now. Internships where you have to pay them. I forget, the guy who edits the magazine now came up with some examples of this. They keep doing research on this. It's just the craziest thing in the world. And so this is the market system in action. And at the Baffler, we sort of took a vow that we would never do that. And so we always, well, the editors never got paid really. We got paid a little bit, but we didn't get paid consistently or very much. We always made sure to pay the people that worked for us. They always got paid. Right up until the end. But what's the way around it? One way around it is to shame the companies that do it, that use the intern labor, and that frankly exploit intern labor. And we should think of ways to do that. And that can be done because they do count on our goodwill. But it's tougher than you might think. Another way is, and I know this is actually happening, that the Labor Department in Washington, D.C. is cracking down on intern abuse in some very particular ways. And I forget the ways in which they're allowed to do it, but the ways in which they're doing it. God, it's in like some particular industry. Help me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Well, I don't. But one thing that I know that is happening is
because it's obviously a violation of minimum wage, but they get around it by saying it's educational.
Right. So we're supposed to give.
So if you can prove it's not educational, if it's just strictly mercenary, then obviously they have to be paying you at least minimum wage. And there are cases now where that's happening. I'd like to see a whole lot more of them. But of course, they always just say, "Oh, it's educational." But I mean, when you're like, I've heard of people interning at places that are obviously have nothing to do with like advertising agencies, stuff like that. What else? I would say that you guys, one of the big problem with internships is that it makes it so that these jobs in media that we all want are the province of rich kids who can afford them. And the reason they can afford them is because their parents can pay for them to live in Manhattan or in New York and not earn a living and just work for free for however long it is, a year or something like that. But guess what? You guys live in New York. You can. I'm trying to look on the bright side here. I'm really no good at looking on the bright side. You guys are already here. You can compete with them. You're smarter. Come on now. And you already live here. It just takes a subway token, damn it. Oh, they don't have tokens anymore. It takes one of those little cards.
Subway tokens. It's so 1990s. I want to open the floor for questions from the audience. What comments or questions do you have for Thomas Frank?
I have a question.
Lay it on me.
Yeah, just on the we're smarter thing, I was wondering where that comes from. The idea that we're smarter than anyone else.
Well, I'm just trying to be optimistic.
Oh, okay. Okay.
By the way, I've also, I've spent my life around, elite people, people who went to elite high schools and elite universities and elite colleges. And what passes for smartness is that they speak in a certain way and act in a certain way and are socialized in a certain way. And they often don't have real smarts at all. They're creatures of consensus. They're creatures of exactly, they do exactly what they've been told, and they behave in exactly the way they've been told, and that kind of thing. And that's why you're smarter than them.
Word.
Yeah, I had a question. You were talking about how watching this Occupy Wall Street panel, they were using too much academic jargon and kind of like lost the message in there.
But I noticed it all over the place. It wasn't just
right.
Once you start digging, it's...
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I've noticed that too, just in my own conversations with friends. But I'm wondering if you think that is more damaging to the public than like really simplistic, like presidential debates, let's say, where it's just like patriotic buzzwords strung together. Like. Yeah,
that's sort of the opposite. Did y'all hear what he said? Which is worse, the sort of that when Occupy reaches for academic jargon that doesn't make any sense to average people, or when politicians, everything is so dumbed down that what they say is just a soundbite that means nothing. I mean, they're both dreadful. They're both bad options. I guess my problems that I had, I expected more from Occupy, and I was sorry to see it get dragged down that road. But I should also say, this is the problem with, I'm 50, I turned 50 the other day. This is I've been on the left. I've worked on left-wing projects for most of my adult life. This is the problem with the left in this country, is that it is heavily weighted towards the academic side, and it does tend to confuse academic expertise with with righteousness. Okay, and that's a mistake for organizing. Politicians is something else again. They're not part of my movement, although I don't know. I mean, Barack Obama uses some pretty weighty ideas in his speeches. He speaks in a. I'll tell you something that's one of the things that I really liked about. I'm all over the map here, okay? But one of the things I really liked about Barack Obama back in 2008 was that he didn't speak in stupid sound bites, and he did seem to be well above the kind of plane of what you expect from an American politician, and I really liked that. At the time, I've since realized that there's a drawback to that too, which is that he respected expertise a little too much, and he put in all of these. And what is it? Larry Summers said this is the most social science oriented administration ever, which is, I guess, a good thing in the sense that they're not going to be denying global warming, but it's also an awful thing in that they've got all these sort of consensus orthodox economists in there running everything, and these guys turn out to be a disaster, So it goes both ways. Dr. Viscusi.
I don't agree with you about Occupy even a little. It seemed to me that it was really kind of an avant-garde theater movement. And no, really, a cross between avant-garde theater and utopia. And 1890s aren't the right period. 1840s is the right period. They were so lost. They had so dim an idea of what actual political and economic action would be that they had to try to reinvent it all. These are kids who grew up holding their parents' hands while they crossed picket lines at Rite Aid and Walgreens. No, it's true. I mean, I remember in the 80s and 90s, people stopped honoring any of the rights of labor at all. People couldn't read for union-led, nothing. So they had to think it through from the beginning, and I don't think...
Had to reinvent the wheel.
And I don't think that we can judge it. This isn't a question of being fair to them, but rather of being fair to our own future. I don't think that we can judge that phenomenon by its political success. Because its political successes were very few. They had one real success, which was that they turned the expression 1% into electoral poison. It's really why Romney lost the election. That's not nothing. But it's also, it seems to me that it could possibly be promising. That the next time there is crisis, those same people and their younger siblings and whatnot will be a little smarter.
I hope so.
Well, because there is this whole history of the Tea Party for them to reflect upon. I mean, a lot of people, older heads, wiser heads, people who had been there before, people who lived through the 60s and 70s and the 80s, knew that you can't have just a kind of a Woodstock experience on Wall Street and change the world. But there wasn't any convincing them because they were actually doing something and they were getting arrested. And let me tell you, they really did that.
That's a big confirmation when you get arrested.
So that's how I see them. I see.
Wait, when you say 1840s, that's interesting. Thinking like the failed French Revolution of 1848.
I'm thinking of like Brook Farm and the feminists at Seneca Falls and things like that. I mean, these people were the laughingstock of the whole country, I'm sure. And yet, feminism took over the world. Abolition started a civil war. Even the Millerites created the Jehovah's Witnesses, who was very good business down in Brooklyn Heights. So I'm not so quick to judge anything that is, on the one hand, so dramatic, and on the other hand, so completely unprecedented. You really couldn't, outside of like the crazier choruses in Aristophanes, I couldn't think of anything that they reminded me of. I mean, those meetings were bizarre. And And unforgettable. If I'm sure you were at some of them.
No. I was in
never went to any
DC.
of
I
the
was in
Occupy
DC at the
meetings?
time. No, they didn't have it.
They
down
didn't
there.
have it in DC.
Well, they did, but
Well,
it was
that's good
they
for them.
immediately had a schism and were and drove everybody away. You know, they're fighting with each other. There were two groups, and they immediately split off.
Well, anyway, that's just my heterodox view of it.
Okay.
I think we have time for one more comment. Yeah.
Hi, Thomas. I have my inequality class here. We're studying inequality all semester. What intellectual ideas have you found to be useful? And jumping a little bit ahead, can you give us a little bit of a clue of what you're going to talk to Krugman about on Friday related to this?
Thursday.
It is Thursday. It's Thursday. Yeah.
Okay.
What ideas have I found? Well, the first thing, and this is so when I first started, I took that job at Salon and started in February, I think, of 2014, and I resolved at the very beginning that I would write all year about inequality, and that would be my subject. Because this is, in a certain sense, this has always been my subject. It's just now that we have this neat word, this neat phrase for it, and the president himself came out and said that this is the challenge of our times, which that sort of made it okay all of a sudden for me to be writing about this again. And there's two things to remember. People's consciousness of inequality didn't start with Occupy Wall Street. There's a whole history of this. And so I wrote about that many times in Salon. This is, in the early 90s when the Baffler was getting going, there was a guy called Kevin Phillips who was writing about this a lot. And, Christopher Lasch, of course, wrote the Revolt of the Elites, this book in 1994 that was very important to me. And so it's important to remember that this has been around, that this debate has been going for a long time, and that there's also, of course, a 19th century analog to it. The new Gilded Age. We're repeating all the same debates that we had 100 years ago. I also, in Salon, I called on. I was surprised that in our current debate over inequality, that we leave everything to economists. And if you look at, and there's various ways of looking at this, like Krugman is probably the best of the bunch, but if you look at the New York Times, they have this series of articles on inequality called The Upshot. You familiar with this? And it's more than half of the writers are economists, and I think probably 9/10 of them are academics of one kind or another. It's all treated as though it were an academic discussion, as though it were a subject that's for academics, when in reality this is a subject that is the subject of how we're going to live together as a society in the future. It's the biggest subject of them all. We should all be participating in this. And when I wrote that, I got a lot of shit for that article. I was kind of surprised. Economists in particular were angry at me for saying that they shouldn't monopolize this debate. And then Piketty's book came out. I'm sure you guys are all reading this. Piketty says the exact same thing in his introduction. This debate should not be monopolized by economists or by sociologists or by historians or what have you. But this is a debate that the entire world, at least our society should be having. And then the other thing that I did that I thought was kind of fun and original was I wanted to do a history of inequality in cultural terms. And so I did a history of the McMansion, which is kind of interesting. Like, where did the McMansion come from? When did it start? When did we come up with that term for it? And so I did all the digging and found out the answers to these questions. Kind of interesting. And I did another one on, what was it? Oh, the history of the tuition price spiral. Because people have been bemoaning the high cost of college, as long as I can remember. So I was like, where the hell did that start? And it actually starts at the same time as the McMansion, 1981. And you can put this is the first year that the price of college tuition went up by some dramatic percentage. I forget what it was. And all these editorials started wringing their hands about it. All these articles, by the way, are for free on Salon. You can find them all. They're a lot of fun. But I remember the first year that tuition went up by 30% or something like that, all these editorialists were saying, this is 1981, how much longer can this go on? And it's like, well, 30 years. But that's not what you asked. I'm sorry. You asked what, I'm sorry, how you...
What are you going to talk to Krugman about?
what am I going to talk to Krugman about? Hopefully this stuff, but the legacy of Obama as it relates to inequality. And so Krugman wrote an essay in Rolling Stone about saying that Obama has been a really great president. And I wrote, because we came out of the recession. He got Dodd-Frank passed, he got the stimulus passed, and he got Obamacare passed, and those are pretty big achievements. And so let's give the man credit and acknowledge that he's one of our great presidents. And my response was, I wrote a response to it, and I said that if you judge, you can't just judge a guy in this abstract way, but by the challenges of the time. And the great challenge, of our time, as Obama himself has said many times, is inequality. And he was handed a golden opportunity in 2008. As I told the last class, this is I'm the broken record always talking about this. We came to a historical turning point in 2008, and we didn't turn. That Obama could have done. The world was at his feet in 2008, 2009. He was the second coming of Franklin Roosevelt, and the world expected great things from him, and he did small things. He did good things, but by no means the things that the situation required. And so I think that's what Krugman and I will be disputing. If we dispute anything, it's far more likely we'll just agree on everything.
Let's thank Thomas Frank for bringing his cantankerousness to us today. Thanks very much. Thank you all for coming.